You guys might get some type of pop-up, might ask you for permission to record. I'm not sure if that comes up on your end or not, but I am going to go ahead and record the class today, and I'll record every class from here on out. So if you missed anything, I know this class was kind of posted mid-semester, and it was encouraged that as many people take it as possible, but there was also the idea that people were already going to be busy this summer. People were going to have other classes, and so this isn't one of those classes where you have to show up. I'm not going to be taking attendance. It's obviously strongly encouraged, because if you're here, obviously you can ask questions more directly. Sometimes when you get the information directly from the person, rather than the recording, it just sinks in better. That's just my opinion, obviously, but sometimes when I'm watching a recording, I'm always looking for like a fast forward button or something like that, because I feel more in control. But when you do it live, you kind of have to take it at the pace that it was given. But regardless, hopefully you can see my screen in entirety. My screen's kind of one of those oblong shapes. So as long as you can see everything that's in this little area right here, that's really all we need to see right now. And what we're going to do today, just as an introduction to the course, is I'm going to go over the basics of the syllabus, like where do grades come from? How do you get in contact with me? What are we doing in this class in particular? Why is it a useful class? Where are we going to find all our information? Where do we find our Zoom invites? Where are we going to find the Zoom recordings? All that kind of jazz. And then we'll do a little bit of fluids and electrolytes. So it should be a pretty easy first day, nothing really taxing. Usually I like to save the worst stuff for the second class or the third class. That way you're kind of already hooked, you know what I mean? Because you're probably going to go home after this, talk to all your friends and family, just say this was the best experience I've ever had. And then on Thursday, you'll change your mind. But still, so if you've had me in class before, this isn't typically my home page here. I think this was something that Belmont Abbey set up for me ahead of time. So I just kind of filled in the blanks. It's like, type the name of your class here. So that's what I did. And I just changed these things as was indicated by the blank page. And I'll probably change this pretty soon, and I'm sure I'll get an email about it telling me to change it back. But I usually don't like this little kid stuff. I mean, if you're this far along in class that we're in an advanced class, then I don't think you need to know that that means inbox or, we have to click on hyperlinks to get to starts or syllabus. But it does have some pretty decent information on it. It just says read the syllabus, check the announcements. I'll use these sometimes if something comes up, or if we want to put something in a location where it's more easy to access. Perhaps I'll use an announcement, and sometimes when I do an announcement, I'll copy and paste it to an email, and I'll send out an email too. But email is the main way I keep in touch with everybody, and that's pretty common in all my classes. So I'm one of those OCD people. I check my emails all the time. Basically, anytime I pick up my iPad or anytime I sit down at a computer, the first thing I do is I'll check my emails, and that's 7 days a week, all times of the day. If I'm awake, I'm checking it about every hour, every 2 hours. It just depends on if I'm mowing grass or not. You know what I mean? So that's the easiest way to get in contact with me, and I can get in contact with you. As soon as I check it, I'll reply to it. So it's the easiest thing. But again, I might use announcements, and I'll probably email you to tell you that I posted an announcement. So it'll be kind of double whammy. I went ahead and put our first Zoom meeting right here. So number 3, I forgot what they had there. I just erased it because it wasn't anything I was ever going to use. So I just went ahead and real bold put our first Zoom meeting. I put the hyperlink to take you to it. But I'll probably get rid of that after today, and I'll replace it. In fact, we can probably do it right now. Let's see. Let's go ahead and replace it. I'll show you the magic of how to build a class right here. Let's say our Zoom invites will be found under the modules. Okay. So let me go ahead and change that. And I'll go ahead and switch pages to show you what I'm talking about. So if you have had me before, which I think about half the class has, modules tab is about the only tab I ever use. I don't do anything with discussions. I don't do anything with most of the rest of this stuff. I don't even know what a big blue button's for. But the modules tab we'll use pretty often. And the syllabus tab, I do come back to this because it usually has a schedule toward the end. Right. So if you look at the very end of the syllabus, there's always a schedule there, and that can kind of give you an idea of where we're heading, where we're going. And this is the same thing I do at the beginning of every class. Like each class, I'll usually go to the modules tab and I'll say, here's where we are today. So this is week 1. We're in this Zoom meeting right now. This is 5:30, 10 a.m. It's about 10:09 right now. We will go over fluids and electrolytes in just a little bit. And that'll be our first class. And then on Thursday of this week, this is our Zoom meeting for Thursday. We're going to start going over neuro. Next week, here's our Zoom invite for Tuesday. Here's our Zoom invite for Thursday. I'm going to start working on some of the neuropatho phys right here. And then we're going to finish up next week with neurosensory. And it keeps going until we get to our first exam. And then it kind of goes blank for a while. Well, I mean, you can see it on my screen here. But this isn't highlighted. So on your screen at home, yours should stop right there. Right. And that's normally how I'll treat my class. So that way we're only focusing on one exam at a time. I don't like to populate the entire modules page with the entire course because it's just too much. Because if you ever miss a day or if you're out a week, you get lost of what you're supposed to be looking at and what am I supposed to know. So I usually will just populate the modules based on one test at a time. So this will be the page you come to most often. Again, this is where you're going to find your Zoom meeting invites, right? So I dated these. Here's 5:30, 6:1, 6:6, 6:8, 6:13, 6:15, okay? And most of the time we're going to be going over a PowerPoint, right? Sometimes we'll go over the same PowerPoint, just different parts. So this PowerPoint and this one are the same, but we're just going to probably stop at slide 30 here, pick up slide 31 here, something like that. I'm totally guessing, but that's the idea. So this is the page we're going to come back to. And at the end of every class, once everything has been recorded, it usually takes a little while, sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes an hour to consolidate the video, and then it gets emailed to me, and then I get a link that I can post it. So at the end of every class, I'll replace the Zoom meeting with the Zoom recording. So this will change, right? And it'll say Zoom recording for 5:30, right? And that's where you'll be able to find the recording. And for the most part, that's how people study for a class like this. When you have Zoom meetings and Zoom recordings, most people just listen to the recordings ad nauseum until it's cemented in their brains. But, you know, I always recommend you study the way I taught y'all to study. Write everything out, treat the PowerPoints as though they are all test material. Every single page is something that I can draw from. So that's where the test information is coming from. As you are aware, there's no book assignment for this class. So basically your information either has to come from these PowerPoints or something that I'll say during the lecture. So that's what you're going to study for this class. No mysteries. There's no mysteries. My classes are usually as straightforward as humanly possible, but there's just a lot of information to always cover. So that's the challenge. It's not figuring out how do I need to study or what do I need to study. It's how much time do I have to study. That's the challenge. So let me get back out of here and I'll come back to it in just a jiffy. But again, this is where we're going to find most stuff. So again, when you first open the class, this is the page it'll come to. So we'll get back out into my dashboard. So here's our class right here. I thought this was an appropriate picture. Isn't that nice? It looks very, it's kind of like, I don't know. Is this Catholic allowed? Is it allowed to have nudity in these pictures? Or is that like, you know, actually like something I'll get bonus points for? I don't know. I don't know what kind of art, you know, is allowed and not allowed. But this guy right here, notice what he's holding right there. It's the little staff with a snake on it, right? That's Asclepius right there. So that's where that symbol comes from. And then here's Hermes, and he's got his staff. And that's where that other symbol comes from with the two snakes. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So again, start here, really not going to be much different than what we're seeing here on the home page. Let me just go ahead and click on it real fast. Again, these things were already highlighted. I was just copying and pasting from the syllabus wherever it told me to put these things. I'm just going to point out some important topics here. We're not going to read through all of it, but textbook, there's no textbook required. If for any reason you want to know where I'm getting a lot of the information from, Frank, what was that author that I told you? It's not Bartholomew, is it?
Aaron Berkowitz?
Berkowitz, yeah. So there is one very small book, and if I had any book to ever recommend to anybody in healthcare to get, there's a book called Pathophysiology Made Ridiculously Simple by Aaron Berkowitz. It is cheap, relatively, for a book. Yep. And it is the most concise form of application of information. And that's the trick with anatomy, physiology, and healthcare. There's so much material that has to be covered in anatomy and physiology. By the time you get to healthcare, you have no idea how to apply it, or you're too scared to even think about how to apply it, you know? But if somebody's in a state of acidosis, it's kind of obvious what you should do, but a lot of times people miss that application point. You know, give them bicarb, right? Take their pH up or take the acidity down. It's straightforward as you can possibly get. So this is what this class is for. It's going to point out very basic physiology. It's going to talk about what goes wrong with it and how we take it back to right. It's simply homeostasis has broken, and so we're going to step in and help out a little bit. That's all it is. That's all healthcare is. But the first thing we have to do is recognize that it's broken, right? So that book's really good and clear for doing that. And then the other main book that I'll probably use for this class is called Human Physiology by Silverthorne. So pretty straightforward name. I wouldn't go out and spend money on it if I were you, because it would probably cost you about $250 for the book. It's pretty decent at explaining the stuff that we're going to use. That'll probably be the book I'll use in the future. But it does have some of the physiology, some of the pathophysiology, and of course, anatomy as well. You can't really escape anatomy anytime you're doing the physiology. So, but again, no textbook required. So what are we going to study for our class, for our exams? We're going to go to the modules, and you're going to be using these PowerPoints, okay? So the PowerPoints and the lecture, me going over the PowerPoints, so the Zoom recordings, that's what you're going to study for the exams, okay? So let me just skip to the syllabus page. I know we were on start here. It's the same information, but let me show you how to get in contact with me if you ever need to. There's my email address. If you want to, after class today, shoot me an email and I'll send you one right back with like a check mark or a smiley face or a picture of a dog like we were doing in chat just a little bit ago. And that way you'll have something that you can keep replying to. So you don't have to go back and look for this if you don't want to. But this is the best way to get in contact with me. These are my office hours. They had me put that on there. I don't know why, because I'm working from home. It's just going to ring in my office, which is like 36 miles away. So I'm not going to hear it. And if I did, I wouldn't answer it anyway. So I always tell people, just don't call me, because the messages is just going to go to my email. I'm going to listen to it on email, and then I'm going to email you back anyway. I'm very weird about the phone, but that's the best way to get in contact with me. If you ever want to do a Zoom meeting, we can always stick around after class. We can get on before class if you want to. We can do it at random times if you need to, but if you need to talk to me face to face, we can do that. But these are my posted hours. It just says 1 hour before and after each class, but I'm pretty flexible. Again, if I'm not mowing the grass, I'm available. Again, Zoom invites will be posted in our modules. Best description of this class I can tell you is it takes you from book to bedside. That's the whole goal. That's the point, is we're essentially trying to learn all the basics that we can, learn to identify norm, be able to see when things are beyond that, have gone beyond normal. Again, if homeostasis is not being maintained, how can we recognize that? You know, what test would we use to recognize that? What is that test telling me? How do I fix it maybe? So it ties in a lot of good information from anatomy and physiology, maybe with pharmacology, or it'll tie in information with anatomy and physiology with lab diagnostics, right? And I even put an extra section in for lab di for you as well. So what are normal values? What does it mean if the value is too high, or what does it mean if the value is too low? And a lot of times that'll tell you which system to look at, right? Like if my electrolytes are all off, let's look at the kidneys, right? If my enzymes are all off, maybe look at the pancreas or the liver, right? And so I'll go over all that stuff with you, but it just tells you where to look, right? It doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what's going on, but it'll tell you where to look, right? And then you can run further tests from that, whether it's imaging, more specific labs or anything like that. So we'll talk about that too. Here's that other book I was mentioning to you. So again, don't go out and order this. All the information that I thought was important, I've already gleaned from it anyway. So it's okay. Me and Silverthorne are tight, so she doesn't mind. And let's see. And if you ever want the end all be all to human physiology, medical physiology, this is the book you would use in med school. It's just physiology by Guyton. That's been used in med school for probably the last 40, 50 years, maybe 60 years. So this would kind of be like the Bible for med school, if you will. We will have papers due in this class. I know that's probably going to be some bad news for everybody. They're very short. They're very easy. If you want a resource for this papers, National Library of Medicine, National Institute of Health.gov will take you to anything that you need. I'll go over the requirements of those in just a jiffy. They are in here. And it's actually right down here at the bottom of the page, but those are two-part. It's going to help your grade if you need help. Like if you score poorly on one test, this will help bring the test grade back up again. And it's essentially why you're in school, because you guys are in healthcare. You're going to basically be dealing with diseased patients, or patients with disorders, or patients with something that has brought them into that facility, and you need to be able to recognize it. So the nice thing about the disease papers is I'm going to leave it up to you what you want to focus on. And if you have a certain idea about what you want to do in the future, like if you're only going to be doing oncology, then you can do all cancers if you want to. If you're only going to be dealing with children, then you can do all pediatric diseases if you want to. If you're going to be doing something with genetics, then it can be all congenital defects if you want to. It's up to you what you pick. But if you have no idea what you want to do, then do kind of like a smattering across all the different body systems. You know, do one for the nervous system, one for the cardiovascular system, one for the urinary system. You can just pick and choose whatever you want. Pick diabetes as one. That should be a go-to. If you want it to, you know, maybe pick physiological changes that come with pregnancy too. That's one of those things that I constantly hammer in our class. Always tell people if there's something wrong with a patient and they're of the right age, like let's say they're not 2 and they're not 102, then it could be diabetes or pregnancy, right? And obviously it would probably help if they were female, but diabetes across the board. You know, if you need a differential diagnosis for some disease, pick diabetes as your differential diagnosis. Maybe lupus, right? That could be a differential diagnosis for virtually everything across the board. But pregnancy, so even though pregnancy is not a disease, that might be something that you could look up physiological changes for, and that could be used as one of your papers. So if you know you're going to be dealing with gynecology or something like that, then absolutely, you know, look up physiological changes for pregnancy and use that as one of your papers too. And again, we'll come back to this and I'll tell you the requirements for the paper in just a second. Approximate order of the course topics today, we're going to do a little bit on fluids and electrolytes. The main thing I kind of want to go over with you in fluids and electrolytes today is that picture of the capillary again. You know, I'm pretty sure everybody's aware that sodium is the major extracellular cation, potassium is the major intracellular cation. We'll talk about what we call that. You know, even though we maintain what's called osmotic equilibrium, you know, the number of dissolved particles inside and outside of cells are relatively the same, you know, per fluid volume. What's in those substances, or what makes it, those substances are always different, right? Like sodium's in high quantities outside, potassium's in high quantities inside, calcium's in high quantities outside unless you're skeletal muscle, and so on and so forth. So a lot of that basic stuff, I'm sure you memorize most of it. If not, I'll just quickly go over it again. But we do want to talk about fluid compartments and how the fluid moves from one compartment to another. So the best way to demonstrate that today is by drawing that capillary again, going from an intravascular space to the interstitial space to the intracellular space and then back again. That'll demonstrate all that. And we can even talk about how inflammation can affect that, where the lymphatic system comes in. It's a glorious, glorious picture because it answers half the stuff that you do in physiology. So that's what we're going to do today. Most of the rest of the time for this week, next week, we're going to be doing nervous system, and that's probably where we'll take our first test, is after autonomics and endocrine. So this will be kind of partitioned together, cardio down to respiratory system and gas exchange. I think I'm going to put this together. When I initially did your syllabus, I had to have your syllabus in a little bit early. I did put lab dye with that too, along with blood, but I think I'm going to separate that out. So, you know, as I was designing this class for this school is completely brand new, so I had to make it from scratch. I was trying to keep the spacing similar for one test versus the next test, so I did put blood immunity lab dye in with the cardio, just because blood, obviously, but I think I'm actually going to separate this one out and be a standalone test that we'll just spend a couple of days on. We'll take it a few days later. So that way it's not such a kind of a mind, what's the better way of saying this than a mind F? It's not such a cluster F in the mind, you know what I mean? Because cardio-phys is going to proceed in a certain fashion, blood flow and pressure is going to proceed in a very similar fashion, respiratory system and gas exchange, they all intertwine really good, but then when you get into blood immunity and lab, it's all numbers and it's very different. So I think I'm going to separate that one out. We're going to have a separate test just for that, and that'll increase your retention for it, which is nice. But these kind of all go together very well. Sometimes you don't even have a separate respiratory system. When you're studying these things, they'll actually put it in cardiovascular. They'll put it together. So I think that'll be a good test right there. We'll separate this one out. And then our final test will be kind of a hodgepodge of different things. Of course, urinary being very important. But we'll do a whole section on just the liver, which we haven't really even talked about very much yet, other than the liver makes bile. You know, that's about all we've said about it so far. You know, obviously cholesterol and plasma proteins are made in the liver. We'll kind of mention that in passing, but there's not a lot of focus on the liver. So we'll talk about hepatitis, and we'll talk about, you know, different types of diseases that affect the liver. In the lab, we'll talk about different enzymes that we might end up seeing. And if those enzymes leak into the blood, that could indicate there's inflammation of the liver. We'll probably talk about the hepatic portal system and why ascites pops up sometimes. So that'll be a nice little short chapter to go over right there. And then our final chapter, we'll talk about cancers and neoplasms. So that way there's not so much of this stuff kind of trickled into every little section. We can just kind of pull them separate, all as one thing, because they all share the same basic idea. For some reason, these cells are no longer respecting cells around them, and they're infiltrating their areas. They've lost their contact inhibition, their tumor suppressor factor is gone, and they've just gone rogue. So they don't look like surrounding cells, they don't act like surrounding cells, but they're very thirsty, they're very hungry. They're going to feed off your surrounding cells, and they're basically going to drain you of all your nutrition and energy. So at the end of it, you know, you get cachexia and die. So they pretty much all act that way if they go untreated. So we're just going to put these all together in one big chapter and talk about some of the big ones that you might run across. So anything from maybe non-small cell lung cancer to glioblastomas or something like that. I really don't know. I haven't made the PowerPoint for it yet. I'm still working on these things. I'm about this far into our class so far, but I'll put in the good stuff, I promise. And by the time we get to the end, our class goes from obviously today up until 8/4. That's when our last test is going to be due, and it'll be due by midnight. All of our exams will be populated under the modules, and there'll be online quizzes. Usually my tests are going to be 50 questions, multiple choice. It'll be timed. So usually you'll get about a minute per question. And it's pretty straightforward. There's nothing complex about it, nothing difficult about it. Most of them, again, are multiple choice. There might be a little bit of matching, something like that. So class isn't meant to be hard in a way that I'm not going to put a lot of thinkers on there. I'm really not trying to mess with you. You know, sometimes in Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2, I want you to think about things differently. So I have to word them in a way where you wouldn't have worded it yourself. So that way in the future, you'll learn how to rewrite your questions better, right? So usually there's 4 or 5 questions in every test I'll do that way, where I've worded it in a way that I know you didn't think to word it that way, right? But now you should be thinking along those lines. So that's what led us to this class, because I didn't know if we were going to have this class or not. So I kind of had to put it in some of my classes. I kind of had to infiltrate my normal classes with this. So now that we're here, everything's going to be as straightforward as humanly possible. I'm going to say, what do we call this disease that presents as this, and this? Or what is the normal value that we should be seeing for this? Or if the value has changed and it's gone from here to there, what do we call that? So there's no tricks. There's not going to be anything, you know, funny about it. There's not going to be any wording that's crazy about it. I want you to have the information. I want you to be able to retain the information. I want you to be able to regurgitate the information. That's what I want, right? So that's how you're going to study for this class. As straightforward as I gave it to you in the PowerPoint and as straightforward as I give it to you in the lecture, that's how I want you to know it. So there's not going to be any tricky stuff going on. So I promise. But again, at first, I think we did have 3 tests. There's a little section that goes over, you know, where do the grades come from? And notice there's not a lot. We had 3 exams at 50 points each. We'll probably do 4 exams. I'm not sure if we'll do 50 points for the lab, maybe 30, 40 points, maybe 50. We can do a survey. We can say, how many points do you want this test to be worth? I want you to get something out of this class. This class isn't meant to be an obstacle. This class isn't meant to be one of those things where it's a nightmare. This is literally designed to help you. That's the whole reason for this class, but it's the same time, it needs to be challenging. You know, it needs to be something that I have to study. I'm going to have to put time into it, hours every day, because you have to memorize this information. But again, it's so you can work better. It's so you're not useless when you get onto that floor at the hospital and they're not teaching you everything, and you become an anchor rather than an asset, right? So you have to know these things anyway. So you might as well just go ahead and learn them now, and that'll save you some time and embarrassment later. Right. So the test is where most of the points are going to come from. The papers is going to be your like life preserver. So if you do bad on one test, papers are going to be worth 40 points. I know it's 10 papers sounds like a lot, but we're here for 10 weeks. Just do 1 paper a week. You'll be fine. Papers themselves, this is what you're going to put in it. Okay. The common question that's usually going to come up with this, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of emails about this, that's going to ask me the exact same thing I'm about to tell you now. Papers, 2 to 2.5 pages, you know, max. I'm not saying minimal. I'm just saying don't write more than that, because you don't need to. We just need to know what's the name of the disease and are there any AKAs. Okay. Like some diseases you'll always hear called one thing. But then on some standardized tests, they're going to call it something else guaranteed, right? That always happens. So if a disease has some type of unusual alternative name, make sure you put that in too. So I think, isn't leprosy also called like Hansen's disease or something like that? Like, I think so. Somebody back check me on that later and tell me if I was wrong or not. But it's one of those things you're like, what? Why is it called Hansen's disease? Or, you know, it's just one of those weird things, but I'm pretty sure that's right. Or something's called Hansen's disease, at least. If it's not leprosy, it's something else that we've heard of, but I'm pretty sure that's it. So that's what I mean by the AKAs, right? So if it's got a common name, put that in there. If it's got any kind of AKAs, make sure you look those up too, or be aware of that too, because that's how a standardized test is going to write it. They're going to throw that one thing in there that they know you probably overlooked. Why did you choose this disease? You don't have to write anything about that more than once if you're all going to pick something that's very specific to your specialty. Like if you're going to specialize in oncology, put that in the first paper, and then you never have to write it again because you'll probably do 10 pages or 10 papers on cancers. But, you know, I picked this because my father has this, or I picked this because I lost a sibling to this, or I picked this because my best friend has this. It can be as simple as that. Just put why you chose it. You can say, I picked this because I heard it in class and I wanted to know more about it. I picked this disease because it was gross. I picked this disease because I saw it on Outbreak, you know, on the movie. So whatever. It doesn't really matter why you picked it. Just pick why, or show why you picked it. Main things that I want to see, obviously, what are the signs and symptoms? Again, a symptom is usually something that's subjective. It's what the patient presents with. Signs are usually more objective. It's something that you would note, you would see in the patient. That's why it's called a sign. It's like a sign saying, hey, I'm this. That's what you're looking at. Like you can see sweating and pallor in a patient. Patient's usually not going to come and say to you, hey, I'm sweaty and pale. You know what I mean? So they'll say, I feel like shit. You know, that's their symptom, right? And you look at them and you're like, oh, you also happen to be sweaty and pale, right? So that's the difference between a sign and a symptom. Symptoms, again, are more subjective. It's what the patient tells you. A sign is what the observer notes in the patient. So once we kind of have a general idea about what we think is wrong with a patient. So let's say they look sweaty, they're hot, they have fever, they feel nauseous. You know, maybe I'll just do a blood test. You know, maybe we'll do a culture, something like that. What test would you run? Okay, so what test would you run for that particular disease? So if we're doing like pernicious anemia or something like that, there's a very specific test we'd have to run, right? You would do something called a Schilling test. If you're doing you know, like Hodgkin's versus non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, you know, there's a very specific test we would look to look at these very specific cells. So if there's leukemia, obviously you can get that from a CBC, but you could also go and look at the cells that pop up in the smear. So, you know, what test would you run to diagnose this disease? Once you kind of got an idea about what this disease is, what's the prognosis, right? Are they going to live? Are they going to die? Is it 100% sure they're going to die and they only have a certain amount of time? So is the treatment basically just going to be palliative at that point? Or is the treatment going to be curative? Those are, you know, usually things that kind of tie into prognosis, right? Because if they're going to die, how are we going to keep them comfortable, right? Or if they're going to live, then how do we fix it? So prognosis and treatment go together pretty well. And the reason I'm putting a lot of these things on there is this is what you would put in normal SOAP notes anyway. Like if you're a physician and you're the one that's observing this patient, if you want insurance to pay you, you have to put all that stuff in there. So that's why I'm choosing this stuff. And this is the normal stuff that any .edu website or .gov website will give you anyway. So one thing I want you to be sure not to do is do not copy and paste this off of Mayo Clinic. You know, don't go to, I mean, you can go to these websites if you want to, but do not copy and paste signs and symptoms word for word what you got off of a website. I want you to type it out, rearrange it if you have to, make it look like you tried, right? If you put 5 minutes into it, make it look like you put in 6, right? But I want you to know this stuff. It's not about turning a paper into me so you can get your points. It's about you learning the disease. So it's just becoming familiar as I want. That's what I want you to do, because you're going to run into a test you've never heard of before. So go look that test up. Go see what it does, right? There's going to be a lot of learning on the job too. You know, you're getting just the basics with school. You know, if you're in school for 4 years, that's not nearly enough time to learn just anatomy and physiology, much less pathophysiology, all of your examinations. There's no way you're going to get that stuff while you're working, you know, and it's going to be repetition, repetition, repetition. So if we can start getting some of that repetition now, it's going to be better. So again, don't copy and paste, read it, paraphrase it in any way, shape, form, or fashion you see appropriate, but put at least a few minutes into it. I don't want the whole web page copied and sent to me. The way you're going to turn these into me, wait till the very end. So if you want to, you can keep a file or a folder on your computer. Just do these on any type of Word document, Google document, whatever you want to do. Give them to me at the end, and you're just going to email them to me. I don't like the submission things they have on Canvas, so I just want you to email me the entire package, right? So you're going to email all 10 papers at once toward the end or whenever you're done with them. So you don't have to hold them to the end if you get done early, but keep them together in a folder and email them to me at the end. Okay? So if you're asking for a due date, whatever the last day of our class is, that's the due date. The faster you get it done, the faster you quit worrying about it, though. So you do it whatever time you see fit. And then again, like I said, here was the early prediction of when our tests were going to fall. This one's still going to be accurate. This one's still going to be accurate. That one's still going to be accurate, but we're probably going to have another one in between there. Okay, so 618 is when we're going to do fluids, electrolytes, and neuro. 712 is probably where we're going to do cardio and respiratory. 84 is probably where we're going to do muscles, urinary, liver, cancers. But we're going to have another one sometime between 712 and 84 for that lab die. And we'll just have, again, a small test, and we'll discuss it when we get there. So don't worry about 712 right now. Don't worry about 84 right now. The only thing you need to worry about is 618 right now, because that's our first test. So we do one test at a time in this class. So every day that we get on, again, I'm going to go to the modules. I'm going to say, here's what we're doing today. Here's what we're doing Thursday. Here's what we're doing next Tuesday. Here's what we're doing next Thursday. Here's our first test. And then I'll go over the format. I'll say it'll be 50 questions, multiple choice, covering fluids and electrolytes, neuro, neurosensory, autonomics, and endocrine. Okay. And I'll do that every day until you're tired of hearing it. But again, it keeps people from getting lost, and it keeps people on track. But once we get done with this exam, then I'll start populating the rest. I'll start populating the next section, right down to wherever our next test is going to be. Okay. So. But right now, all you can see is up to the first test anyway. Okay, so that's where yours should end right there. Let me look at, see if there's any last minute things I need to go over. So grading system is the same as all your preliminary classes. I don't know what the grading system is for the nursing program directly. I don't know if y'all do a 10-point system or if y'all do this very unusual partial A minus, B plus, B minus system, but this is what I was given, so this is what we'll go with. Again, I'm not taking attendance. People pop in, they pop out all the time. I'm not checking that out. Like once you've arrived, you know, I'll usually welcome people a few minutes before a class. I'll usually get on about 10 minutes before every class starts, and whoever is there by time it's ready to go, that's what we're going to go with. You can pop in at any time if you want to. If we've gotten done early and you pop in and there's no meeting, that means we've already finished. So maybe go back and look for a recording to pop up soon after that. Some days will be very short, like on test days, I'll usually just pop in and I'll see if there's any last minute questions. I'll review with you if you want to. You can ask me questions, because sometimes I'll put little questions within the PowerPoint and you can just ask me, you know, what was the answer to this? I never could find it. Or did you ever mention this in class? I never heard it or saw it, and I'll go over it with you. If you got questions, just ask the questions. But sometimes it'll be best, you know, toward the end of lectures to do that, just because we're in a Zoom lecture and there's a delay. Like when I say stuff, it'll usually be 2 seconds later before you hear it. So if you say something, I'm not going to hear it for 2 seconds till after you say it. So I might start talking again. So it gets real weird when you start asking questions directly on Zoom. So you can type them in chat if you want to. You can save them till the end of class, and I'll go over the question with you and anybody else that wants to stick around and hear it. But We'll have specific days, usually on the test day, that it's just, that's all we're doing is just questions. So if you pop in late on that day and I'm not there, that means we probably already finished that day. But again, I'm not taking attendance for every class. I'm going to record every meeting and I'll post every recording. So there's no such thing as makeup test in our class. Try to get it done by the due date. If you go a little bit late, get it done as soon as you can. Again, this class is here to help you. It's not here to hinder you. So if you got 4 classes this summer or 5, like Frank probably does, get it done when you get it done. But don't put it off too long, because it becomes a stressor. It becomes like a bag of bricks on your back. You know, even though you're getting a couple extra days to study, that weight slows you down. So the due dates will obviously be as soon as we finish the last material, probably by the end of that week or the day before we start the new material. And it's just the ideal time to get it done. So that way we can start with a clean slate. You're not having to worry about old material and picking up new material. But again, there's no such thing as a makeup test in this class. Take it when you're ready to take it, but try to keep it as close to the signed time as you can. We don't repeat test or anything like that. Again, I'm pretty straightforward. I know Dr. Ayala is probably as straightforward as you get to. My grades are my grades, right? Whatever you make on the test is what you made. I have nothing to do with that. All I'm going to do is grade it, and then I'm going to give you the grade you earned. We don't do extra credit or anything like that. The papers will serve as that. The papers will give you a little boost. If you got a bad grade, then the papers will help you, but I do not want extra work at the end of class to bring up a grade. It's just not going to happen, because A, I don't want to look at it, and B, it's not fair, you know. And so you should get whatever you get, whatever you earn, that's what you keep. Okay. So if you got a bad grade the first test, what are you going to do? You're going to make better on the second test, and that's as simple as it gets, really. So I don't think anybody's going to have a hard time with this class. But again, at the end of the semester, don't ask me for something extra to do. That's silly high school stuff nowadays. We don't, and that shouldn't even exist in high schools nowadays, but it does. Let's see. I will make all reasonable accommodations for everybody. I've already gotten my letters for that. If not, and you know you have accommodations, make sure that Carrie sends those to me. I think I've got them for this class already. I doubt there's going to be anybody for tutoring and academic support in this class. I am your go-to for that. I don't even know if there's any summer STEM tutoring at all, to be honest with you. If there is, it's news to me, but let me help you, right? If there's something that you got a question on, email me. I will respond as thoroughly as I possibly can. And again, if I can't cover it in an email, then we'll hop on Zoom and we'll go over it. So I'll help with that stuff. So I am your end all be all information. Let's see. Yeah, so that's pretty much it for the syllabus. Does anybody have any kind of crazy questions or anything like that? You can always type in chat if you want to, if you got any questions. Because we're going to do a lecture in just a jiffy. And a lot of times with lecture, I'm going to be using, I know you're probably looking at my screen right now. Let me stop sharing for just 1 second. This is my whiteboard. If you're wondering what you're staring at right here, this is like a little mouse pad that I stole from room 110 because it was just in a drawer. And I was like, that's nice. I'm going to take this home with me. So it's here now. And this is just blank white paper, and I'm going to write on it. So this is going to be our marker board or our chalkboard. So that's just an easy way to do things, I think. But normally, as we're going over the PowerPoint, I will go through the PowerPoint with you. So for example, we're going to be working on fluids and electrolytes in just a few minutes. I'll give you like a 10-minute break in just a second here, as I can tell you're all kind of, you know, fighting to stay alert and focused, and it's tough sometimes. So if you want a coffee break or a bathroom break, we'll take a break in about 2 minutes here. But fluids and electrolytes is what I'm going to work on. You don't have to open yours on your end, because again, I'm going to kind of pop up full screen and go back and forth between my screen and the PowerPoint, and I'm recording this anyway. So I'll just do mine, but this is what we're going to go over in just a few minutes. If anybody's got any big time questions like this isn't working for me, or how do I do this? Stick around for the next 2 minutes. If you don't have any questions right now and you just want to take a quick break until 11, go ahead and do that now. It's 10:48 right now, but I'm going to pause the recording. So let me actually. And just for your viewing pleasure, I went ahead and opened up the Fluids and Electrolytes PowerPoint here. So I'm just going to switch screens. Sometimes when you get on Canvas and we're all here together, Canvas slows down drastically. So a lot of times I'll come in class early and I'll open up things ahead of time. But again, I'm just opening up this PowerPoint right here. So here's our Zoom meeting for today. All right, here's our PowerPoint we're doing today. Here's our Zoom meeting for Thursday. Here's what we're going to do on Thursday. So again, I'm just opening up this PowerPoint here, but I'm going to switch screens. Okay, so boom, there it is. And again, this information might be a little bit foreign to you because this didn't come from the same book that we normally deal with in Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2. And we're obviously dealing with different cohorts of students here as well. So what Dr. Ayala used before is probably going to be slightly different as well. And that's okay, because that's part of the whole reason for this class is a unification of information. When things get said differently, sometimes it's better to hear it as many different ways as possible. So, and regardless if we use the same book or not, people are going to teach it differently too. So I'll say different things with a different emphasis, just because when I read it, I'll see certain things that are important. And when Dr. Ayala reads information, she sees certain things that are important, and they're all important. It's just the problem we run into with anatomy and physiology is it usually takes about a good 6, 7, 8 years to learn anatomy and physiology. And we're trying to squeeze it into 2 semesters. And luckily now we're able to expand it to 3. So again, it's a good start. It's a good start, but those aha moments sometimes take a while before you get to them. But in human physiology, one of the big concepts that it tackles first is an idea called compartmentalization, which is something that we see throughout anatomy and physiology. Like you deal with it very early. Like one of the first things I think we did in Anatomy 1 is we talked about serous membranes. That was like at the end of the first class after we talked about the superior means above and inferior means below, and lateral and medial mean to the side, and all that kind of stuff. We got to the end of the first PowerPoint and we started talking about parietal pleura, visceral pleura, parietal peritoneum, visceral peritoneum. And that was talking about compartmentalization. So we didn't describe it that way at that time, but it's the same basic idea. So when you're talking about your thoracic cavity, that's separated from your abdominopelvic cavity, right? And there's even separation between the cavity itself and the organs within the cavity. And we line those with serous membranes. There's compartmentalization within individual organs. Obviously, the content inside of the stomach is going to be slightly different from the content inside of the small intestines, right? Because your stomach is very well designed to deal with very low pH or very high acidic, concentrations. But once you get into the small intestines, it'll irritate it. So we want to separate those two. When that acid gets into the esophagus, it'll irritate it. So we want to separate those two, right? So we have sphincters that helps compartmentalize the stomach. And then you'll even have bicarbonate ion coming in from the pancreas to help buffer the solution coming from the stomach to the duodenum. So compartmentalization, you actually talk about quite a lot in anatomy and physiology. We just don't make a big deal of it, right? Even within cells, you talk about compartmentalization because that's what every organelle is. It's a small compartment within the cell that has its unique or basic functions. But the biggest compartments that we can talk about in the body are the fluid compartments. And this is something that I know everybody has seen before. And normally we'll end up drawing a picture that looks something like this to describe the 2 major compartments of the body, right? And these are what's considered functional compartments. It's the movement of the dissolved substances within the fluids of the body going back and forth from one compartment to the other that makes things work, right? So they're considered functional compartments. But again, you probably have just heard of them as the major fluid compartments of the body. So the fluid compartments are functional compartments, okay? In Human Physiology, which is a book where this comes from, it talks about 3 functional fluid compartments. I don't typically describe it that way, even though this is what the information is stating. I understand where they're going with it, but ECF is a compartment, ICF is a compartment, and then you can subdivide ECF into 2 separate spaces, but I wouldn't call that a third compartment necessarily. So they're shared amongst each other. If I had to put in a third functional compartment, you know, it's technically not supposed to be intertwined with the other 2. I might put in a third space, right? But again, we're going to describe ours a little bit differently. So just kind of follow me as I end up drawing this stuff out, because we're in a second going to draw our capillaries, and we're going to talk about these 3 fluid compartments that are mentioned here. And one of them happens to be a subdivision of the ECF. Okay. So again, just follow along with me and we'll be just fine. So on my page here, I am just going to subdivide it. I'm trying to make sure I got as much space as possible in here. All right, I'm going to put a little square right here. This square represents basically the entirety of the body, right? This circle within the square represents all the cell membranes as if you were to join them all together, right? And this isn't meant to be a comparison based off size. I'll go over that information with you in just a second. It's just showing separation. That's all it's showing is separation. So 2 major fluid compartments we have in the body is the ICF, which is the intracellular fluid compartment, right? And the ECF, which stands for the extracellular fluid compartment. And as elementary as this probably sounds, this is the crux of all physiology. This is how all physiology is going to work. Intra means within. That's just what the word intra means. Like inter means between, but intra means within. So intracellular fluid compartment is the fluid we find within all the cells of the body, right? Extra means beyond, right? So if you want, you know, extra credit, that means you're going beyond what was required of the class and you're doing something extra, right? Which we don't do in this class. I'm just using that as an example. But that means the fluid beyond the cell membranes. So this is the extracellular fluid compartment. Okay? So pretty straightforward so far, right? The first time we ever talked about this was a long time ago back in neuro. And the reason we had to mention this in neuro is we were talking about depolarization phenomenon. And depolarization, I can draw you a graph in just a minute if you want to, is where we take certain dissolved ions that are going to be found in higher proportions in the ECF, and we allow those to kind of diffuse in or migrate into the ICF. And by doing that, it's going to change the charge of this cell membrane, right? So for example, when you get into the intracellular fluid compartment and the extracellular fluid compartment, a lot of the important stuff that we find dissolved within these fluids are going to be charged. And whether those are organic substances like proteins or they are simply ions like sodium and potassium and calcium and magnesium, a lot of them carry charges with them. And that's where the term electrolyte comes from, right? They carry electrostatic charges or electrical charges, right? And that electricity is what's going to power the body. It's the movement of charged particles. No different than the movement of charged particles going into your lamp right now. It's no different at all. It's no different than the movement of the lithium ions in your phone moving to one side of the battery when you're charging it up and moving to the other side of the battery when you're using it, right? It's the exact same functionality. It's just movement of charged particles. So we call those things electrolytes, right? So in your extracellular fluid compartment, your most abundant electrolyte, of course, is sodium, right? And sodium is a very important one. Sodium helps maintain proper charge of the body overall, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. It determines where chloride is going to go sometimes, because chloride loves to follow sodium, and it also determines where water is going to go. And that's something that we see in a lot of different chapters, especially when you get into urinary and endocrine. Like when you talk about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. Aldosterone is something that can help us control our sodium and potassium levels. But at the same time, it's also helping us to conserve water by conserving sodium, because that water will follow sodium wherever sodium goes. So if a lot of sodium leaves the body, water is going to leave the body. If a lot of sodium stays in the body, water stays in the body. So that's a big important role of sodium. But it's also going to be what allows us to depolarize things like neurons and muscle cells, right? And muscles could include skeletal muscles. It could include cardiac muscles. It could even include, smooth muscles. And it's not alone. Sometimes calcium helps too, but sodium's the big one for sure, right? So sodium we call, of the electrolytes, sodium is your major extracellular cation, okay? So it's the positively charged ion, a cation, that we find in the greatest abundance outside of the cells. Okay? So again, this is the first time where this picture was probably taught to you. Maybe not. Again, I don't know for people that were in other classes, but that's usually where it comes up first. Okay. And then inside of cells, of course, we still find sodium, just not nearly as much, right? Sodium's an extracellular ion, so we usually find it outside of cells. But potassium is the major intracellular cation. Okay? So potassium we find in almost as high quantities inside of cells as we find sodium outside of cells. So potassium, I'll just write it down here, is your major intracellular cation. So again, cation is a positively charged ion that we find in the highest abundance inside of cells. Okay. And again, it's not alone. There's plenty of other ions. Like if I share my screen with you, I think we have another page somewhere along here that shows some different ions and their general locations in cells. But I don't think I'm going to draw all that out. So maybe just point out a couple of things, like some of the negative ions like chloride and bicarbonate we can find out here. Phosphate we can find inside of cells. And that'll come up later as something that can be an indication of cell damage later. Perhaps if we end up seeing a lot of protein and phosphate leaving the cell and getting out here, that might mean something happened to the cell. So there's further application other than just learning how depolarization and repolarization work. But again, here's kind of a general distribution of where we find a lot of these things. And calcium, even though I don't have calcium really labeled out here, calcium is typically found out here. And this will vary depending on chapters and places in the body, but calcium, if I had to locate it, is usually an extracellular ion. So specifically, when you're dealing with heart depolarization, that's where it's going to come from, is the blood, right? So the blood is beyond the cell membrane. But of course, in skeletal muscle and some smooth muscle, you'll have sarcoplasmic reticula that can store calcium inside. So, but if in general, I had to say, where's calcium generally found in relationship to the cell? It's typically outside in ECF, okay? But again, this starts to become a little bit confusing when you look at it all at once. So let's go back to this, right? And the basic idea, when we had these different ions located in these different compartments, that basically set us up for later when we wanted something to take place, like when you were dealing with action potential, right? And action potential, if this is a multipolar neuron, right? Or it could be a muscle cell, or it could be a heart muscle cell, I mean, I'm just drawing a multipolar neuron because, again, this is where we learned it first. You have a bunch of sodium on the outside of the cells. right? Let's not worry where potassium is right now. But if we were to stimulate this neuron in some way, shape, form, or fashion, either through touch, if it's a tactile receptor, or maybe through pain, if it's a nociceptor, or through temperature change, if it's a thermoreceptor, or it could be a neuron, and we're stimulating it with excitatory neurotransmitters. Either way, whenever this neuron gets stimulated in any way, shape, form, or fashion, it'll open up a local sodium channel. And sodium will then diffuse inward. So that's why we set the body up like this. It's basically setting us up ahead of time so diffusion will work, right? And sometimes what we call this concept or this idea is we call it chemical disequilibrium, right? And I know that's a weird concept. Let me see if I can find the proper slide, and then I'm going to switch over. There's a slide in your PowerPoint on page 8 that talks about some of these concepts that I just mentioned, right? Even though I can't spell them apparently. There we go. But in your body, we try to maintain what's called osmotic equilibrium. You're probably familiar with that concept when you deal with what's called isotonic solutions, right? And the basic idea of isotonic solutions is water can freely go through a cell membrane anytime it wants to. So the relative number of dissolved particles I have per liter of solution inside of cells versus outside of cells is, again, relatively the same, right? So if you took the total number of dissolved particles per liter of solution, it's going to be relatively the same inside of cells as outside of cells, and that prevents your cells from shrinking by water going out toward a hypertonic solution or swelling by water coming in a hypotonic solution, right? So again, hypertonic solutions means you have more solute in your ECF than what you do in your ICF, or outside of the cell in the solution that the cell is bathed in versus inside of the cell. And since water loves solute, if you place a cell in a hypertonic solution, the cell will shrink, shrivel, or crenate and look like this, right? But if I were to place a cell in a hypotonic solution, right, meaning that the solute that the cell is placed in has a lower concentration of ions the solution, I meant to say the solution that I placed a cell in had a relatively lower number of solute or ions, then the water is going to look inside of the cell and see all these guys and think that's where the party's at, right? So the water is always going to be heading toward these solute particles. So wherever we have a greater amount of solute, water will go, and that's basically osmosis. The movement of water through some type of semi-permeable membrane to areas of higher solute concentration. So here, where's more solute? Out here. So where's the water going to go? Out. In this picture, where do we have more solute? Here. So where's the water going to go? In, right? So this will be described later in the PowerPoint, and we're not going to go over every single slide. You can read it a little bit later, but this sometimes happens with people. So one of the examples I probably mentioned to you in class before is if you take some type of runner, and that runner's been sweating for like hours, like maybe they're running some type of marathon, and you're sweating out both salt and fluid, and then you get very thirsty at the end of the race and you just start drinking water, that becomes very problematic, because if you're replacing lots and lots of water without electrolytes, then you're creating a hypotonic solution for the body, right? Because I sweated out both water and electrolytes. All that sweat kind of came out of here, right? And so when I start to replace that with just water, it dilutes whatever electrolytes you have left. So you have essentially created a hypotonic solution. So where is this water eventually going to go? Inside of the cells, right? So your cells will start to swell. So some people have actually died from that very situation. So one of the exact situations I told my class about one time was there was a gym up in Chicago, and they were trying to promote healthy living and drinking more water, right? So they had a contest at the grand opening of who could drink the most water the fastest. And essentially what they did is they created people with hypotonic solutions in their body. And I think 3 or 4 people died. So I'm very skeptical whether that gym ever really made it or not. I'm probably going to go no. I didn't really see the consequence of that thing other than people died from that little game they were playing. But this does happen sometimes to people that are doing long distance endurance type of races where they just drink water after they've sweated out both water and solute or electrolytes, and they create hypertonic solutions. Hypertonic solutions, of course, these are pretty easy to gain. You know, put a bunch of salt on your food, eat a lot of salty popcorn, have a lot of soy sauce, something like that. You're going to be increasing your solute concentration like sodium and chloride very rapidly, right? And that's going to take a little while for your kidneys to filter out the excess, right? So the whole time that your kidneys are working, you're very thirsty because your cells have already kind of leaked out some water going to that higher solute concentration, and you become very thirsty when the cells in your hypothalamus get shriveled up or crenated. So it's pretty easy to create a hypertonic solution. But this is what we're trying to maintain all the time is isotonic solutions. So in order to do that, we have to maintain what's called osmotic equilibrium, right? And so the hypothalamus is going to set what that's supposed to be, and then your kidneys are going to be the ones in charge of making it happen, right? So it's all part of homeostasis, just like everything is. Everything is geared toward homeostasis. It's just when we first mentioned homeostasis in chapter 1, we don't really have a lot of examples that we can use. You know, we can use real prominent ones like body core temperature. You know, if I get real hot and my body core temperature should be set at 98.6 to 98.1 to 99.1, that's a pretty good range. And 98.6 is what I'm aiming for, right? If I go up a little bit, that's not such a big deal. But if I go up too much, then I need to start sweating so I can go down, right? And if I go down a little bit, that's not a big deal. But if I go down too much, then I need to start shivering because we need to go back up. And that's an example that we commonly use in, like, say, a chapter 1 of anatomy 1 when we're talking about homeostasis, but everything works by homeostasis. So osmotic equilibrium, this is something that the hypothalamus sets. It says we should have this many milliequivalents per liter in the ECF and this many milliequivalents per liter in the ICF. And then the kidneys are trying to kick out stuff as needed, trying to retain things as needed. So if I take in a very salty solution, then my kidneys are going to be working in overdrive trying to pee out that excess sodium chloride, right? But if I'm just constantly taking in a lot of water, then my urine will eventually just become very dilute. And that's all you'll try to get rid of because you're going to try to hold on to the electrolytes as tight as you can because you're already diluting them and you're going to try to get rid of that excess water. So by maintaining this osmotic equilibrium, your cells can basically stay in a more of an isotonic state, right? Isotonic solution. So that's nice. But even when we maintain osmotic equilibrium, it doesn't mean that the solute outside of the cell and the solute inside of the cell are the same solute, right? That's what we're talking about with chemical disequilibrium. Like, for example, sodium is something that we find in high quantities outside of cells, but not inside of cells. Potassium is something that we find in high quantities inside of cells, but not outside of cells. That's a chemical disequilibrium. And again, we're setting that up ahead of time so we can use it when we need it, right? Phosphate, that's something that we see in higher quantities inside of cells. And it has a very negative charge to it, believe it or not, right? So again, these things we're setting up ahead of time, a lot of time using stuff like pumps, perhaps, you know, ATP, you know, to do this. So believe it or not, a lot of your basal metabolic rate is used to maintain this and this, right? Because every cell of the body is constantly having to kick on pumps to kick things out that leak in or we allow in as we open up gates and channels. And once it goes out, we got to kick it back in again or pump it back in again. So we actually use a lot of ATP energy just maintaining these basic phenomenon, right? But again, osmotic equilibrium, if we look at our page here, is essentially what we have here. I didn't really count it out, but let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Pretty close, right? That's kind of what we're seeing here. The number of dissolved particles in the solution outside of the cell and the number of dissolved particles or number of charges, I guess you could say, inside of the cell or individual pieces, right, that we're seeing inside of the cell because both are important, the charge plus the number of pieces. Each individual potassium, each individual sodium is worth 1. right? Regardless of how big or small it is. That's where osmolarity comes from. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but they're relatively the same inside and outside. But what they're composed of is different. So here we have sodium in higher concentrations outside. Here we have potassium in higher concentrations inside. Okay, so that's the chemical disequilibrium. So why do we generate chemical disequilibrium? Why don't we just let everything move to where it wants to? Because eventually you would reach what's called diffusional equilibrium. And when you get diffusional equilibrium, that's a problem, because then things don't have any tendency to move out. They're not going to have any tendency to move in. So therefore the charges don't have any tendency to go one direction or another. So that's going to decrease our ability to move electrons around or electrolytes around or charges around, and our body will cease to function. So that's what happens when you die. You know, a lot of times when you hear about death, you might hear about something called rigor mortis. And a lot of times rigor mortis happens because the calcium that was stored inside of your sarcoplasmic reticulum can't be held anymore, and it leaks out. And the sodium leaks in and potassium leaks out, and everything just becomes static. But because that calcium leaked out, it made the muscles contract, right? But obviously, for a normal healthy body to work, we want more sodium on the outside than we have on the inside. So that way, when I need to turn this thing on, right? Like if I say I start at negative 70 millivolts, that's my resting membrane potential. And if I can get it to negative 55, which is threshold, then I can generate an action potential. So how are we going up in charge here? This is a millivoltage charge. We're allowing sodium to enter, right? Carrying that charge with it, changing the overall charge of the cell, right? So as positively charged sodium ions go from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell, that's causing this graph to go upward. So we call that depolarization, right? And when you're repolarizing, as we're going downward, again, we're becoming more negative now. That was when potassium left, right? And that was called repolarization. So again, we have to set this up ahead of time for it to work, right? So we need to make sure there's more sodium outside of cells than inside. We need to make sure there's more potassium inside of cells than outside. And we can't do that without compartments, right? We can't do that without energy. So it takes a lot of effort to get this set up ahead of time. But now that we do have this set up with this chemical disequilibrium, where we have larger amounts of sodium on the outside and larger amounts of potassium on the inside, then we can depolarize things like neurons in muscles. But if this ever gets messed up, guess where we're going to see it first in the patient? In their neurons, in their muscles, their heart, right? So heart is very sensitive to that stuff. You know, your heart is almost completely dependent on blood ion concentration because it has very poor sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SA node, the AV node, even the ventricles, the cells within the ventricles, they're sensitized to these electrical particles. And slowly but surely, things like sodium and calcium can leak into the cells as potassium's leaking out. And that's what causes the, they're called cardiomyocytes. I was trying to think of a better name for it. The heart muscle cells to depolarize. It's just, again, the movement of these charged particles. So if these things are off in the body, like if I'm hyper or hyponatremic, hyper hypokalemic, hyper hypocalcemic, it's going to screw up all those things that depend on these processes, right? Again, like neurons, heart, muscles. And I know heart's a muscle, but I just like to separate it. So let me share again with you. So that's the basis of fluids and electrolytes. That's the whole idea. That's the whole idea of fluids and electrolytes. But one thing that I did mention earlier in Human Physiology by Silverthorne talks about what's called 3 functional fluid compartments. Again, that's kind of a weird thing, but let me show you where that's coming from. So back to my paper here. Let's say that we have our normal little picture here. This square is basically the whole body. The circle is all the cells within the body. And this circle itself, the outline of the circle represents all cell membranes of the body. Here's ICF, which is basically just one thing. It's the fluid that we find within all cells of the body. ECF, however, is more than one thing. So this is where the 3 comes from in the 3 functional fluid compartments. ICF literally is just intracellular fluid. But ECF, you can subdivide into two different spaces. You can have what's called the intravascular space, which is the same as saying plasma, basically, right? We're just going to say intravascular space. And then you have what's called the interstitial space. So that's hard to draw on this picture. So what we're going to use to represent this is our capillary diagram, which if you've seen this before, and if you're in my class, you've seen it 60,000 times, this will be a review, and we're going to kind of expand on it a little bit for those that haven't seen it before. But this is going to look different than the type of capillary pictures you see in books. So what I usually draw here is a larger vessel becoming progressively smaller, eventually getting to the smallest type of vessel. And this is going to end up being our capillary. And you can tell where the capillary is because I'm going to draw a dotted line, because capillaries are permeable. Okay, that means they leak. Right? So I'll go and label all this in a minute, and I'm going to draw probably several of these pictures just so we can have multiple ideas, but it's just going to be the same picture drawn over and over again. So bigger, smaller, smallest, bigger, biggest, I don't know. But this is our capillary. This is where the main focus is on. And I always like to kind of read left to right. Not all books do this. Some books, it'll be coming from right to left, but you can kind of tell where the flow is going to go if you know which side's the artery side versus which side's the venous side. So this is going to be my artery. And I'll label this for those that didn't have me before. So big A is going to be artery. Little a is going to be arteriole. C is going to be capillary, of course. Little v, which we're not going to be able to tell the difference between little v and big V unless they're together, is going to be a venule, and big V is going to be a vein. So here's my venule, vein. So what's the difference? Well, arteries are larger vessels, arterioles are microscopic in size, but they share the same basic parts and pieces, okay? So arteries, if you remember from cardiovascular, have three layers. They have what's called a tunica externa, tunica media, tunica intima, also known as the endothelial lining. Arterioles will share those same basic three layers, right? So in arteries, they're pretty well developed and thick. So something like that, right? But an arteriole is just basically a smaller version of an artery, but the same basic parts and pieces, okay? Veins, believe it or not, share the same basic three layers as arteries do too, but they're just less well developed. So in a vein, the walls are much thinner. And that's going to give veins different properties than arteries. And we can talk about it again in cardiovascular, but hell, let's just talk about it now, because repetition is the key. And that's the whole point of this class, is to repeat things that we've already learned until it's automatic, right? Because we need to get so automatic on normal that anytime abnormal pops up, we can recognize it. Because that's all healthcare is. You know, I used to run a very profitable business by seeing a patient. They told me what's wrong with them, and I could tell them if I could fix them or not. If not, I just had to know who to send them out to. That's it. It was very simple. I'm like, oh yeah, you need to go see Bob. Bob's better at this, right? And I cannot handle this. So that's all you got to be able to do is recognize abnormal. So we're going to see the same stuff over and over and over again. We're going to draw the same picture over and over and over again. We're going to describe these same parts and pieces over and over and over again. But arteries, because they're three layers of the wall or are thicker or more developed, they resist stretch, right? So by resisting stretch, they add something called elastic recoil, which will push back, and that maintains a higher pressure on the artery side of a capillary. So your artery or arterial side of a capillary is your high pressure end. And the way blood circulates through the body is it's always going down what we call a pressure gradient, going from a higher pressure end to a lower pressure end. So guess where our lower pressure side is? It's on the venous side, right? So this is our lower pressure side. And even though veins have the same basic ingredients that arteries do, they have a tunica intima, which is an endothelial lining. They have a tunica media, which is going to be muscular, circular muscle tissue. And they have a tunica externa, which is mostly going to be like collagen and elastin, like connective tissues. Same thing we saw here, right? It's much thinner. So they're more distensible. So veins, by being more distensible, as blood comes in, even if it's a lot of it, they can just expand out. And again, it maintains a lower pressure. So if we always have a higher pressure artery side, moving toward a lower pressure venous side, that keeps blood flowing, right? Which is nice, because if blood doesn't keep flowing, then we'll go into shock, right? Which can happen if we mess up our capillaries too much. So we might talk about that later. But just with this picture alone, this is the basics. We got blood going from artery to arterial, through the capillary to the venule to the vein. This space that exists right here is our intravascular space, right? It's the space within the vessels, intravascular within the vessels, intra within the vessels space. I'm not belittling you by describing these words, I'm just reinforcing. So what about the intracellular fluid compartment? What about the interstitial space? Isn't that what we were talking about? We were talking about the fluid compartments. Okay, so imagine we have cells that live out here. Here's a cell, 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 cell. There's just cells everywhere. Cell, 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 cell. Right. And within each cell is the intracellular space. So this would be ICF, 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 this is ICF, this is ICF, right? This is ICF. This is Dave. We're going to call him Dave. This is ICF. So if I take all these ICFs together and I unify them, it's this, what you find inside of the circle. So this is meant to represent all the cell membranes of the body. So the fluid that we find inside of cells is just the intracellular fluid. So we put those all together, you have the intracellular fluid compartment. And then in between your intravascular space and your cells is interstitial. Isn't that easy? So the interstitial space filled with interstitial fluid is what the cells are bathed in. It's found in between cells, right? And it's also found between the vessels and the cells. So the interstitial space. So your two parts of ECF are intravascular space and interstitial space, while your ICF is all the fluid found inside of cells. So that's what that slide meant when it was talking about the three functional fluid compartments. But again, it's really two where one's subdivided, right? Here's a picture out of a book that talks about how capillaries work. So we'll talk about this movement of fluid in and out of capillaries, because again, this is more beneficial than just this chapter. But since we're already talking about fluid compartments, let's talk about how stuff travels between these fluid compartments, because essentially all my cells need to metabolize, and cells need ingredients to metabolize. They're going to need oxygen. Where's that going to come from? They're going to need chemicals, nutrients, electrolytes. Where are those going to come from? How do we get it there? So we'll describe how this works. And again, we'll see this in multiple chapters. We're going to see this again in cardiovascular. We're going to see this. I mean, we're going to do this exact same thing again when we get into blood flow and pressure. I mean, we're already talking about it now, but again, it's repetition, repetition, repetition. Some things will be boring, but the more you're like, oh, I'm so tired of hearing this, I know it now, the closer you are to the finish line. Right? So when we discuss capillaries, a lot of times we're discussing movement of fluid going from one space to another, okay? So here's my artery, here's my arterial, here's my capillary. Again, just a little dotted line because capillaries are permeable. Some capillaries are going to be more permeable than others. I'm going to use a pretty general level of capillary permeability where when we talk about things like filtration and reabsorption, all the small stuff filters out except for cells and plasma proteins. So that's the level of permeability that we're going to be at. Right? But there are certain places in the body where we can have larger substances moving in and out of capillaries, and things like your liver and your spleen, we can do that. Bone marrow, we can do that. And there's certain places in the body where less stuff can filter or reabsorb in and out of a capillary, like in your brain with the blood-brain barrier. But in general, most capillaries are permeable enough to where the intravascular fluid, like the plasma, can come and go from the intravascular space to the interstitial space and then back again. But larger substances like cells and plasma proteins cannot. That's why the dotted line's here, because it's acting as a filter. Okay, so I'll explain it again. Here's our artery. Here's our vein. Here's our capillary. Cells live out here. I'm just going to put like 2 cells right here. Let's just put a cell or 2 right here. And in order for our cells to metabolize, they're going to need certain ingredients. Like we need to fuel them. You know, I have to take them things like glucose, which would be a very small particle dissolved in the blood plasma. Maybe they need amino acids to build things. Maybe they're making hormones or neurotransmitters. Maybe they're building fibers for muscle tissue or collagen. You know, they need parts to work with. So I'm going to give them some type of energy. I'm going to give them something to build with, right? And all that stuff gets dissolved in the plasma. And they're very small particles, right? Very small particles. Right? So all that stuff gets dissolved in the plasma. So in order to take stuff from, say, the intravascular space, the plasma within the capillary, first to the interstitial space, I have to get it out here first, and then the cell membrane can decide selectively what it wants to take up and what it doesn't, right? We have to get it here first to do that. So we're going to go through a process on the arterial side of a capillary called filtration, right? So filtration, just listen to me because I don't want to write this out. It's going to take up too much space, but listen to me when I give you the definition of filtration. Filtration is the pushing of substance and ions from the capillary to the interstitial space. So filtration is the pushing of substance and ions from the capillary to the interstitial space. So where's that substance and ions coming from? It's coming from the intravascular space within the capillary, right? Dissolved in the blood plasma. Okay. I mean, it's already in the intravascular fluid. Where did this stuff come from? Could it come from other parts of the body? You know, if it's hormones or blood gases, you know, maybe it came from glands or maybe it came from the lungs. But if it's a lot of the dissolved electrolytes and nutrients, it probably came from the digestive system, right? So when I absorb protein, I turn them into amino acids, and those amino acids can float around in the blood. They're very small. When I break down disaccharides or starch, those turn into monosaccharides like glucose, right? And that goes into the blood, right? Very small. You know, when I'm breaking down fats, I can get triglycerides, and those actually break down even further, but then we repackage them back into triglycerides, right? And those can float around in the blood too. But what about vitamins and minerals? Yep, that's in there too, right? So nutrients, we might call most of that stuff. And these are things that cells won't need, right? Again, glucose is going to be usually our primary fuel source. We're going to release that energy from glucose in the presence of oxygen. So oxygen is something that we're also going to be delivering on the arterial side of a capillary out to this space. But oxygen, let me just make it clear here, doesn't go through filtration, which is the pushing of substance and ions from the capillary to the interstitial space. Oxygen just simply goes through diffusion. So because oxygen and carbon dioxide are fat-soluble gases, they can easily move through capillary walls or membranes, because this is basically just simple squamous epithelium right here. All right? The capillary wall is just a continuation of the endothelium of arteries, arterioles, and it's what goes on to form the endothelium of the vein. It's always present. It's just when you get to a capillary, that's all that's present. You don't have the muscle, you don't have the connective tissue. So obviously we can't filter and reabsorb through arteries and veins because the walls are too thick. But when you get to the capillaries, all you have is simple squamous epithelium. And simple squamous epithelium, if you remember, is good for processes like diffusion and filtration, right? So where are places in the body that we see a lot of simple squamous epithelium? Capillaries, alveoli, lymphatic capillaries and vessels. But O2 can diffuse out, and then all the substance and ions, those can be filtered out, right? And that will occur on the arterial side of a capillary. So essentially what's happening is the fluid plus these dissolved substances are making their way out here along with the oxygen. And again, if I'm going from higher concentration to lower concentration, if this cell has already previously metabolized, that can easily enter. These nutrients can enter as long as the cell membrane needs them and wants them. They metabolize and then they can generate waste, right? Or maybe product too. Maybe I'm going to kick out some product for this to carry away somewhere. Right? Maybe this is a glandular cell. Who knows? But again, you need substances from the blood to operate. You need energy to do that. And then as you metabolize, you're going to produce things called metabolites, which is essentially the same thing as saying wastes. And the same blood that delivered these nutrients to you will also be helpful picking that plasma back up again. So the plasma is the fluid portion in here. That's what all this substance is dissolved in. And the plasma not only delivers the nutrients to the cells, it's also going to carry the waste and the leftovers back in. So I might not have used all these nutrients. So some of it's going to come back in. The waste that I generated out here, that's also going to come back in. So CO2, again, just goes through diffusion to get back in from higher concentration to lower concentration, right? So that's going to use diffusion, but all these other particles, which could be metabolites, plasma, right? Any unused nutrients, those are going to get picked back up. And when they get picked back up here, if it's not a blood gas like oxygen or carbon dioxide, then we're going to go through a process called reabsorption. So filtration was the pushing of substance and ions, like the dissolved solute, from the capillary to the interstitial space. So filtration is the pushing of substance and ions from the capillary to the interstitial space, right? Reabsorption is the pulling of substance and ions from the interstitial space back into the capillary. Okay. So again, just kind of memorize the definition of filtration versus reabsorption. Drawing it again. I think when I learned this stuff, we were in cardio phys when we did this drawing. And we did this drawing almost every single day for a whole semester. Just changing parameters, changing solute concentrations, changing things that would happen to the body. Like if we burned the body really bad, you know, what's going to get lost? You know, what's going to accumulate out here? So we won't be able to hold on to fluids. You'll accumulate a lot of cellular debris, which is going to be a lot of protein and electrolytes get lost out here. That sucks all the water out of the vessels and you go into shock or something like that. You could use this picture for everything. I'm not going to use this one now because I muddied it up, but you get the idea. But every day we would kind of change the parameters. Like what happens when you go into anaphylactic shock. And I can talk about that in a minute, but again, let's just do some basics. So filtration occurs on the arterial side of a capillary. Reabsorption, I'm just going to write up here now, occurs on the venous side of a capillary. Right? There's certain forces that generate filtration versus reabsorption, right? The primary force for each one is CHP for filtration and CCOP for reabsorption. Okay. So when we deal with hydrostatic pressures, those will push away from themselves. It's like if I have fluid inside the artery and that fluid was compressed by the heart, right? Generated lots of pressure. Once it gets out into the aorta kind of expands a little bit, but then it presses back, right? And so when that wall of that artery presses back, again, that's going to generate high pressure in here. And that pressure is going to be pushing on the walls, going away from itself, going down a pressure gradient. And by the time I get to the capillary, now I don't have anything holding me back. So even though we do have these little small openings, fluid and all the small substances dissolved in that fluid are now able to leave, and it's that capillary hydrostatic pressure that's doing most of that work, right? So if I'm capillary hydrostatic pressure, I'm pushing away from the capillary toward the interstitial space, right? So what's the main driving force for filtration? Capillary hydrostatic pressure, CHP. So hydrostatic pressures push away. Osmotic pressures will pull toward. Sometimes they'll call it creating an osmotic gradient. Like if you have osmosis occurring, it's basically saying that we've found or generated more solute in this area versus this area. And if water can easily move back and forth between one area and the other, it'll always go toward the solute. So capillary colloidal osmotic pressure is going to be pulling fluid back in toward the capillary. So you're pulling toward. So if I'm capillary colloidal osmotic pressure pulls toward itself. There's a higher osmotic gradient in here. Then we're pulling toward the capillary. That's the main driving force for reabsorption. So CCOP is what's going to pull that in. Most of your CCOP, I'm just going to put a little star here, is generated by a plasma protein called albumin. And because we have a higher protein concentration in the blood than we do the interstitial space, that's what allows reabsorption to work, right? So if I end up with a disease like kwashiorkor, which I think I put that in your PowerPoint somewhere, maybe. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't. If I end up with a disease like, say, kwashiorkor, kwashiorkor is the same thing as saying protein malnourished, right? Like it's not general nutrient malnourishment, that's marasmus, but kwashiorkor is I get carbs, I might even get some fat, but the protein is just negligible. So it usually comes in populations where all they eat is rice. You know, that's all they have. They don't have enough beans for everybody. I'm being completely serious about that. I'm not just trying to throw in rice and beans, but they just have a high, abundance of grains, but they don't have any protein that they can share amongst each other. So they become protein malnourished. And because my liver, in order to make albumin, needs basic building blocks like amino acids, how am I going to get those, right? You have to have at least 8 essential amino acids to build all the other ones. So if I can't get those from my diet, then I'm just going to have to do without. So if a person has kwashiorkor, they can't produce enough albumin. So their reabsorption back into vessels sucks, right? So when they filter out, the fluid accumulates out here in the interstitial space and it pockets out there and it can't get back in. So that we might call edema. And in the case with kwashiorkor, it's called ascites, where it accumulates in the abdomen, in the belly. So that's, again, basic ideas. So hydrostatic pressures push away from themselves, osmotic pressures pull toward themselves. And when you're dealing with movement of fluid in and out of capillaries, filtration is mainly going to be governed by capillary hydrostatic pressure, pushing away from the capillary to the interstitial space, right? Reabsorption is mainly going to be governed by capillary colloidal osmotic pressure. Because we have a higher concentration of proteins like albumin inside of the vessel than we do outside, it pulls in, okay? So it's just osmosis. And the reason the proteins didn't leave as we were going through the capillary, because they were here over on this side, they're still here over on this side, is because, again, things that normally should not filter, things that do not filter through capillaries under normal circumstances, are things like plasma proteins and cells, right? If I want to get plasma proteins and cells out here, I have to change the permeability of the capillary. So maybe I would release some type of histamines or heparins locally, and we can go through an inflammation process where we can get cells out temporarily. But under normal circumstances, these things will be too tight, right? It's not permeable for those substances. So CHP, CCOP are the main driving forces, but you also have IHP, interstitial hydrostatic pressure, which, again, if we remember, hydrostatic pressures push away from themselves. There's really only 2 spaces we're talking about here. You got the capillary space, which is intravascular fluid. You have the interstitial space. So if I'm pushing away from the interstitial space, going back into the capillary, right? And we also have something called interstitial colloidal osmotic pressure, because we have solute out here that can draw water, and if it's in the interstitial space, it'll pull toward itself. So when you get into filtration, pushing of substances from the capillary to the interstitial space, the main driving force is CHP, but you also get a little bit of help from ICOP. Okay? But what if somebody's got a lot of cellular debris in the interstitial space from, say, surgery or inflammation or cellulitis? Then you're going to get a lot of filtration, and that fluid's going to get stuck out there because that fluid's going to go toward that interstitial space, toward the interstitial space. We've really accumulated too much ICOP. Okay. Reabsorption, think CCOP plus a little bit of IHP. So what if I am swelling? What if I am swelling too much out here? How can we get it back in? Well, if this isn't enough on its own, let's add a compression garment, because a compression garment would generate more IHP, right? If I compress this area, pushing down, pushing down, pushing down, that's going to generate more interstitial hydrostatic pressure. So now I can take this swollen area and push it back in. So even when we're inflamed, like we're swelling, we can add compression, and that'll balance those two back out again, right? So again, why would I have too much ICOP, which is normally a minimal force, if I have a lot of cell debris or cell destruction, right? So wouldn't you imagine that you would swell after surgery because you got a lot of cell debris that needs to be cleaned up? Or if you got cellulitis, cells are destroying themselves, right? Because your immune system's maybe attacking them, right? That's going to increase my ICOP, so you're going to swell up a lot out here. Swelling and edema is just when you pocket too much fluid in this space, and it's not going back in. They'll sometimes call that third spacing, but third space by definition is usually an anatomical location. But if you put too much fluid in one place and it just gets stuck there out here, that's also third spacing. But again, if I am swollen out here, I have a lot of edema. How can I get it to go back in? Increase the IHP with compression. So again, we're talking about normal and then changes from normal. So what's the two normal forces that are controlling filtration reabsorption? Mainly CHP and CCOP, with a little bit of help from ICOP and IHP. But if this gets too high, we're going to start to swell up. So we can increase that if we want to, mechanically. Isn't that cool? Let's look at what happens under inflammation. Watch this. So here's my artery, arteriole, capillary. So let's imagine I have a puncture wound, and this puncture wound came through the skin. That's problematic for a couple of different reasons, right? Skin itself is going to have staph, strep, E. coli on it all the time, fungus, right? The object that penetrated the skin is going to carry its own pathogens, right? So now that's all in here, plus all the cell debris of the destroyed cells. So when you destroy those cells, they're going to release chemicals, and those chemicals are going to be chemical communicators. And what they can do is they can signal an inflammatory response. So when you get inflammation, inflammation is highlighted by 4 key changes. And if it's real bad, 5, but you get rubor, tumor, dolor, and calor, right? Redness, swelling, pain, heat. And usually the reason that happens is because these capillaries are going to change. They're going to become more permeable. So some of these spaces are going to kind of disappear. So I know the spaces are still here, but the spaces are going to become much wider. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow things like your white blood cells to get out and allow more fluid to get out, because we want to clean this space up as much as we can. And we want things like white blood cells to be able to get out to the site of infection, inflammation, cellular debris, and damage, because we need to clean all this stuff up. So during that time of inflammation, your capillaries have become more permeable. So that's where the swelling is coming from, all that fluid escaping out. The pain, of course, is coming from the cellular debris and damage. The increased temperature is coming because we're getting more blood flow closer to the surface, right? And it's also turning red because of that too, right? So, but the problem is even though inflammation I'm sorry, the light keeps changing. The camera's kind of automatic. Let's see if that helps. The problem with inflammation, though, is once this stuff gets out, a lot of things like plasma proteins are going to come out here too, and there's going to be a lot of fluid that builds up in here. This will be swollen, right? It's going to become edematous. And so I need to get these plasma proteins eventually back in, right? I need to take some of this excess fluid that's having a hard time getting back in here, back to the cardiovascular system. So that's where your lymphatics comes in, right? So again, if I'm losing all this excess fluid, plus these plasma proteins, and IHP still can't get enough back in because we're swelling, we're pushing more than we're pulling back in, then we're gonna have to pick that up with something else. So that's where your plasma proteins come in. I mean, not plasma proteins, that's where your lymphatics comes in, because they can pick up the plasma proteins, they can pick up some of this debris as well, they'll pick up this extra fluid, and they'll eventually deliver it back to the cardiovascular system. So now we've covered 3 chapters worth of information with that picture, because we didn't talk about lymphatics until we got into anatomy 2 toward the very end. We didn't really talk about capillaries until we got into the cardiovascular system. But now we've included it with the fluids and electrolytes chapter as well. Everything goes together, obviously. It's just, that's the hard part of anatomy and physiology, is you get all these systems separately, and seeing their interaction with each other becomes very blurred, right? But everything is basically moving toward or away from homeostasis, and we got to figure out why and how can we get it back, or why is it not going back on its own? So we'll use the same picture again, multiple chapters. Urinary is another one where it comes up, right? Remember, in urinary, you have an afferent arteriole going into a glomerulus, which is just a big old capillary, and an efferent arteriole going out. So what's happening right here? You have a lot of pressure coming in, because you got this big old renal artery pushing tons of blood into the kidneys, and the kidneys receive about 1/4 to 1/5 of all the blood of the body all the time. They receive a grossly disproportionate amount of blood, right? So that's a lot of pressure coming in from that direct branch, that renal artery coming off the abdominal aorta, and you get a lot of filtration, right? But instead of going to an interstitial space, it basically just gets picked up by a Bowman's capsule, and that dumps it into the tubular system, so we can sort through it, right? But what's going to get filtered out here? Plasma, right? Plus all the dissolved substances. So that's what's going into that tubular system. And we need to reabsorb all the good stuff that we want to keep back into a capillary, and the stuff that we don't want to keep, we leave in the tubular system until it leaves. But it's the same basic concept. It's just a capillary, right? It's just a capillary. So if anything happens to CHP, then we can't filter well. And if we can't filter well at a kidney, that's a problem, because that's going to make us start to retain waste. And if it's due to CHP, then that might mean that our blood pressure has changed. And so we're going to start a renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, so we can start to increase blood flow to the kidneys and increase blood pressure and fluid retention, right? So all this stuff keeps going back and forth, the same basic topics. So one really basic topic that we kind of have to do first is fluids and electrolytes. So let me go through this real quick. I'm going to let you go. It's almost time. Most of this is pretty easy reading. Everything's very spaced out. Again, there's going to be terms that you've probably never seen before, different types of hyper and hypovolemia. But it's a pretty easy read. But if there are any particular questions I have in here, let me see if I can answer those for you. Which phenomenon are directly allowed by these disequilibria? So when it was talking about chemical disequilibrium, electrical disequilibrium, again, it was talking about we have similar amounts of dissolved substance and ions inside of cells and outside of cells, but what those specific substances are is different. And of course, that's called chemical disequilibrium, where we have higher amounts of sodium outside, higher amounts of calcium outside, higher amounts of potassium inside, and so on and so forth. The phenomenon directly allowed by that disequilibria is things like depolarization. So neuron depolarization, muscle depolarization, heart action, so an SA node being able to fire is the same. It's depolarizing on its own. It's self-excitatory. That's what we call that. How do we maintain these disequilibria? Through pumps. We're constantly, like, once you get done with action potential, right? If we're talking about neurons, during that refractory period, which was, if you remember the chart, that was resting membrane potential. Here's what's called threshold. If we got to threshold, all the sodium channels opened up and sodium rushed in. And then when potassium was leaving during the repolarization period, you would notice that it would go below the resting membrane potential. This was called a refractory period. And during that refractory period, that's where we're turning on the sodium potassium pumps, because sodium was supposed to be an extracellular ion, but a lot of it had rushed inside of the cells. And potassium is supposed to be an intracellular ion. So during depolarization, sodium rushed in. And during the repolarization, potassium left. So during this refractory period, we're going to flip that back around again. We're going to take all the sodium that's in here and pump it out. We're going to take all the potassium that's out here, pump it back in. It works better when they're kind of going opposites of each other. So it's like a revolving door where they're both pushing from each side. It just makes it more energy efficient. That's what a sodium potassium pump's for, right? So pumps help us move things. Like when you contract skeletal muscle, calcium kind of leaks out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum as soon as we get depolarized. But to get it back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum so we can relax, you have to pump it. So pumps is what allows me to do a lot of that stuff. And then the electrical disequilibrium that we're talking about here, this is another similar idea. That overall, the body has electrical equilibrium, right? Mostly what the body will have is, like if you're looking at the whole body's fairly neutral. Like if you're looking at the whole body, here's my body right here. That's me, right? If you're looking at the whole body is neutral, no charge, okay? But inside of the cells, we have a certain charge to it. Like inside of cells tend to be electronegative. Outside of the cells tend to be electropositive, but all together, it ends up being electroneutral, right? So we need to maintain that too. And we need to maintain that through the kidneys. So if I start kicking out a bunch of positively charged ions, like say hydrogen, let's say potassium's already in my tubular system, and here is tubular secretion of hydrogen ions because my body is in a state of acidosis. I need to get rid of hydrogen faster. So we're going to add hydrogen directly from the blood to the tubular system, like to the collecting duct. But because I can't change the overall body charge, I'm going to have to reabsorb potassium back in again, right? So we'll end up having to keep potassium while we're getting rid of hydrogen. So sometimes when a patient has acidosis, they'll also become hyperkalemic because they're trying to reabsorb potassium to maintain overall body charge at the expense of getting rid of that hydrogen that's causing them to become acidic to begin with. So that's important. So sometimes we're going to end up seeing electrolyte changes in order to maintain proper pH, right? And that's something that you'll notice when you're working, right? So you're like, why does this patient have hyperkalemia, right? Is it a kidney problem or is it a pH problem, right? Because kidneys work, but they're slow. But if the kidneys aren't working at all, you can expect there's going to be a gross manifestation of fluid electrolyte imbalances, like retaining a lot of fluid. Electrolytes are all out of whack across the board, like sodium's off, potassium's off, all of them are off, right? You know, but could that be an aldosterone problem too? It could be. But again, what's calcium looking like? What's magnesium looking like? What's chloride looking like? Again, how much fluid do we have? What's the GFR? So again, there's always going to be indications that it could be one system or another. But let's say that we're hyperkalemic and there's nothing really off about the kidneys. Maybe pH will tell me something, right? Or maybe are they diabetic and are you giving them insulin? That can change, you know? So again, we're just trying to get as many tools as we can, but this one chapter ends up becoming very, I guess, dispersed amongst every other chapter that we end up doing. And we'll talk about all these big concepts. But for now, let me go ahead and let you guys go, read through the rest of the PowerPoint. The pathophysiology kind of comes after the electrolyte imbalances, kind of goes over normal ion functions and locations, or the intracellular, the extracellular. Anything that's bolded, make sure you know that, that helps. It doesn't get into all of them. We'll do this more when we get into lab diagnostics, but here's where the diseases and conditions come up. So things that we would see that would affect our fluid electrolyte balance. Like if I am just constantly peeing all the time, what if that pee is just extreme and it's extremely dilute? Maybe that'll concentrate the electrolytes, but you'll be, you know, hypotensive and all that kind of stuff. Is it a hormone imbalance where, you know, I tend to have too low sodium, too high potassium? So maybe that's how we could determine if it's an aldosterone problem versus, say, a kidney problem. In a kidney problem, everything's going to be out of whack. But if it's just aldosterone, then only two things should be out of whack. Sodium should be too low. Potassium should be high. So if I don't produce enough aldosterone, it can't reabsorb sodium the way it's supposed to, or I can't secrete potassium the way it's supposed to, right? Hyperparathyroidism, like when you're dealing with calcium, right? Like if you deal with parathyroid hormone, PTH, right? That's supposed to help with blood calcium levels. Remember, calcitonin puts calcium in the bone. It takes calcium out of the blood and sticks it in the bone. So if I'm hypercalcemic, calcitonin and thyroid hormone are good. But if I am hypocalcemic, then we want to take calcium out of the bone and stick it in the blood. So parathyroid hormone does that. But what if we produce too much? So that means I would be breaking down bone too quickly, right? Your bones would become very thin, right? We would notice that on an X-ray perhaps, and then your blood calcium would become too high, right? So you'd be hypercalcemic, right? So that could be due to hyperparathyroidism. But anywho, you'll see how all these kind of work together. I think you'll be kind of pleased with how straightforward and simple some of these ideas are, because again, they reinforce things that you've already learned before. Maybe it's just coming from the opposite perspective, opposite direction. Again, like what does aldosterone do normally? And then what would happen if I don't produce enough? So similar to what we would have done in my class with endocrine for this one. Okay. But again, if you got any questions about this, email me anytime. I'll answer as many as I can. We can also answer questions when we meet next time. So our class on Thursday, again, if you are just entering into the class, just go ahead and go to the modules page from now on. So number 3, it says our Zoom invites will be found under the modules. Just go to the module page. Just go to the date. So Thursday, 6/1, click right here. That'll take you to our next Zoom meeting and we'll start working on some neuro. But also I'll answer any questions that you have about fluids and electrolytes on Thursday, or again, anytime in between. But for now we are out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.